Does the shift in tone mark a more substantial change elsewhere? International Trade and Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc was in those meetings. He's with me now. Minister, it's good to see you again. Thank you for making the time.
Good morning, Vashti. Thanks for inviting me.
What tangibly, in your view, came out of that meeting?
I think your introduction said it very well. It was a cordial, respectful, business-like tone, both in the public portion in the Oval Office and then at the working lunch that followed. It was probably 90 minutes, the working lunch. The conversation from our perspective was respectful and constructive. The Prime Minister raised, obviously, our concerns around the impact of tariffs, the damage that they're doing both to the Canadian and the American economy. And he, as he said, he and the President had conversations about other sort of geopolitical global issues. As you know, the Prime Minister's chairing the G7 leaders meeting in Kananaskis, Alberta, later in June. So this was an important step along the road to having Mr. Trump back in Alberta for the G7 a little over 4 or 5 weeks from now.
Did your government get any indication that those tariffs could be, not would be, but could be lifted completely? And I ask because in the White House and during the media spray, the president indicated the opposite. I looked to the deal agreed to and announced late in the week with the UK, in which some tariffs still remain. Some are reduced, but some do remain. Was there any indication given to your government at those meetings that the tariffs could ever completely be removed?
I would say that the Prime Minister obviously made the economic argument as to why, as I said, they're not helpful both to the American economy and the Canadian economy. But the President was consistent both privately and publicly in terms of not giving us an assurance right away that all of the tariffs would be lifted. What he did, I think, is listen carefully to what the Prime Minister offered in terms of economic and security partnerships that can be in the interest of both countries. And he agreed to continue the conversation and to work. Secretary Lutnick and I spoke the evening we got back to Ottawa on the Tuesday evening last week. When we landed in Ottawa, Howard had called me. We've spoken again subsequently later last week as well. So we have a process, I think, that will continue the conversation. I'm hopeful, Vashti, and we, as the Prime Minister has said, we will not stop working and accepting that the status quo of some version of these tariffs remain in place. We had a free trade agreement with the United States that President Trump had signed. So we will continue to put pressure on the American government until we get back to a respect of a free trade agreement that has worked well for decades. But I'm not naive. We have a lot of work to do to get back to that point. But we have a path forward, a starting point that was constructive. So we'll just continue to push over the next number of weeks.
Given the unpredictability of the president, I think a big part of your party's message during the campaign, and the Prime Minister's in particular, was that we have to look inward, right, to buttress our own economy so that we're not in the vulnerable state we have found ourselves in over the past few months. In particular, he talked about making Canada an energy superpower. What does that mean?
So that, Vashti, was also part of the conversation that I participated in when the Prime Minister convened the First Ministers, the Premiers, on a call Wednesday last week. So when we got back from Washington the next day, he reported to the Premiers on the progress and the substance of our meetings. And the conversation very quickly turned between the Prime Minister and the Premiers into exactly those issues. Having one Canadian economy, not 13, so removing the barriers to commerce and trade between provinces and territories. Also, national projects that are essential to making our economy competitive and more productive. It would include energy corridors. It would include access for Canadian energy products to different markets. So the the Prime Minister, as you know, and Premier Moe have agreed to have an in-person First Ministers meeting the first week of June. So a lot of those conversations will take place at that meeting at the beginning of June. And we're going to continue to develop in collaboration with the provinces and territories that list of nationally significant projects that we will work on collaboratively with them.
When you reference getting Canadian energy, for example, in what you just talked about, to other markets, do you mean conventional energy? And to be specific, does this government intend to demarcate itself from the government under Justin Trudeau in its approach to oil and gas, to be blunt?
Well, I think the Prime Minister, both in the election campaign and his comments since, and as we know, he grew up in Alberta, went to high school in Edmonton. He knows the province of Alberta very well. He had a constructive conversation with both Premier Smith and Premier Moe. So we intend to be supportive of the Alberta economy, and our government recognizes the importance of conventional energy in terms of the economic prosperity of the country. We can do both. We can support a transition to less carbon-intensive forms of energy, but recognize that the world continues to need conventional oil and gas, and Canada should be a reliable, dependable supplier of those energy resources as well. So I'm confident that we have absolutely found the right balance, and I'm confident, recognizing, as I say, the Prime Minister's desire to convene the First Ministers in Saskatoon and work with Premier Moe. I've spoken to Premier Moe since the First Minister's meeting. I'm very confident that we can support every part of the country's economy in a way that will bring greater prosperity to the whole country. That was what we offered Canadians in the election, and we're at work doing that now.
Do you concede, though, that the sentiment in Alberta and Saskatchewan is that that was not the case over the last 10 years, and that there is a high level of concern that that could continue under a Mark Carney government because you have not, for example, backed off of an emissions cap for the oil and gas sector, or C-69, which the Supreme Court even called your government out on? Why are you sticking to those policies which that part of the country has felt greatly inhibited their economic success?
So again, the Prime Minister, I think, has Prime Minister Carney has taken a constructive and positive tone with respect to Western Canadian resources and their importance to the Canadian economy. He is in ongoing conversations with other First Ministers, including obviously the First Minister, the Premier of Alberta, the Premier of Saskatchewan, and others. Those conversations will happen over the next number of weeks. If he's convened them, as I said, in person in Saskatoon with Premier Moe, it's precisely to have those conversations and understand how the Government of Canada can be a partner. The fact that he's saying that we should collaborate in terms of the review approval process for large projects with provinces, one project, one review, not duplicating work that's done by provinces. This is a significant departure from the previous government, and the Prime Minister has, I think, shown a great deal of understanding and openness to support the economy of these resource-intensive provinces.
With all respect, though, Minister, how is it a great departure? I mean, once again, tone is not action. And I think that's the point that the premiers of Alberta and Saskatchewan have been making repeatedly over the last number of weeks. And the only actions that we've seen so far is that your government is standing by an emissions cap that the sector and those provinces say will be punitive in nature insofar as limiting the increases in production in that part of the country for oil and gas. And you're sticking by C-69, which they have essentially dubbed the No More Pipelines Act. Like, what action specifically will you take to address the concerns of a very important part of this country?
So you'll forgive me, Vashi, but actions, as we speak this morning, the election was less than 2 weeks ago. The new government hasn't been formed in terms of a swearing in of a new cabinet. Parliament will come back in a few weeks. There'll be a speech from the throne delivered by His Majesty the King. So you'll understand, and the First Minister's meeting has already been scheduled to happen in Saskatoon, co-hosted with Premier Moe. So I understand the question. I understand the concern of people across the country with respect to those issues. But the government is at work. The Prime Minister is very much conscious of those concerns. And we will be working through them with those provinces. But to say that we've landed on a final set of measures or that previous government's policies will not change in any way, I think is an oversimplification. The first cabinet meeting after Mr. Carney became Prime Minister, he got rid of the retail carbon tax. Pretty important in parts of the country like New Brunswick, where I come from. I think he's shown a willingness to evolve policies, but we have to let the government be sworn in, and we have to let the Prime Minister talk to the premiers over the next couple of weeks.
That's a totally fair point, except for the two policies that I highlighted, the emissions cap and C-69, are things that your party and the Prime Minister said during the campaign he would abide by, which is exactly why I selected them, which is also why you heard from the premiers of Alberta and Saskatchewan, pardon me, on those very policies. They have identified them as clear irritants, and during the campaign, your party said you would stick by them.
And again, I'm not surprised that different premiers from different political parties find policies of a Liberal government different than perhaps they would like. The important thing is that we can have respectful, productive conversations with those governments, which is exactly what we're doing. We're going to work on a whole number of areas where there's broad agreement between our government and those premiers, and continue to be a constructive partner. Mr. Carney has shown enormous openness, we think, to Western Canadians, to the provincial governments and territorial governments they've elected. That's the work that we're going to continue to do, and the final answer is far from defined.
Okay, Minister, I'll leave it on that note. Appreciate your time as always. Good to see you.
Thanks, Vashi. Have a great day.